for those who might be dabbling in the case and thinking that they know more than the average Joe, there is unknown male DNA on JonBenét's clothing, multiple different parts of her clothing.
Evidence for additional DNA testing. He didn't say what evidence it was, but that it was submitted again. Or perhaps new. We don't know if it was new or stuff that had been tested before. We, of course, have advocated that if certain evidence, the problem with the old leadership, it was the old guard. These people that were in that police department had never investigated a murder. They decided.
29 years, 3 direct questions, and all 3 times the answer veered somewhere else. Today, we're dissecting every one of those moments. I'm Marcus Wren, the creator of the TELL Index, a 50-signal framework for analyzing statements and behavior in criminal cases. I don't speculate, I cross-reference evidence. If that's the kind of work you're here for, hit subscribe, because this video is going deeper than anything you've seen on the JonBenét Ramsey case. On the morning of December 26, 1996, at a home in Boulder, Colorado, Patsy Ramsey called 911 just before 6 in the morning, reporting that her 6-year-old daughter had vanished from her bed, and that she had just found a ransom note on the back stairs. Nearly 8 hours later, John Ramsey himself found his daughter's body in the basement. JonBenét did not survive. The cause of death was later determined through the forensic autopsy. No one has ever been charged in nearly 3 decades. The Ramsey family lived for years under what the press called a cloud of suspicion before police officially declared them cleared in 2008, based on DNA evidence. Patsy died in 2006, 2 years before that happened. And now, right on the 29th anniversary, John Ramsey is back in front of a camera talking about new evidence. We're going to hear the entire interview, uncut, and stop exactly 3 times. At each stop, we'll do 3 things: name the exact signal in the TELL Index system, cross-check it against the actual case file, and see how well the interviewer did her job.
And for one family in Colorado, it is also a very dark anniversary. This month marks 29 years since 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey was found murdered inside her own home in Boulder. That means nearly 3 decades of questions and investigative missteps, and one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. JonBenét was killed the day after Christmas, 1996. Strangled, her skull fractured, her body left in the basement. And despite some brief moments of hope over the years, no one has ever been charged in this crime. But there may be a new development. Boulder police have just said that they have new evidence in the case. In their annual update, Police Chief Stephen Redfern said that JonBenét's murder remains a top priority, and he outlined new steps being taken to move the case forward. Take a look.
This past year, our detectives have conducted several new interviews, as well as re-interviewed individuals based on tips that we've received. We've also collected new evidence and tested and retested other pieces of evidence to generate new leads. Techniques and technology constantly evolve. This is especially true with technology related to DNA testing. Detectives continue to consult with outside experts from across the country, as well as our state and federal partners, to strategize and explore all options when it comes to evidence testing.
Police are not saying what that evidence is or who has been interviewed, but they are confirming that new and follow-up interviews have been conducted and that new evidence has been collected. They also say that older evidence has been retested using advances in DNA technology with help from state, federal, and outside experts. I'll get to that in a moment, outside experts. Investigators are again urging anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward and tell police, even this many decades later.
The host opens by setting the scene, replaying the clip of Chief Redfern announcing new evidence, then brings John Ramsey into a live conversation. The first question she asks is exactly the right one to open with. What specifically is the new evidence, and where does the retesting of the old DNA stand? There's nothing to fault in this question. It's direct, exactly what the audience is waiting to hear.
Well, Chief Redfern told us, gosh, I don't know, September, we had a meeting with him, and that he had submitted evidence for additional DNA testing. He didn't say what evidence it was, but that it was submitted again. Or perhaps new. We don't know if it was new or stuff that had been tested before. We, of course, have advocated that if certain evidence that was taken from the crime scene has never been sampled, that it ought to be. The main one being the garrote that was used to strangle my daughter. So it's encouraging. And, the key really in progress has been the addition of new leadership there. It was not very good for 25, 26 years. And brought in Chief Red from the outside. I've met with him 3 or 4 times. I'm impressed with him. I think he's sincere and honest. And so I'm encouraged. And, we've advocated.
I can't believe.
But the answer is a different story. Stop right here. Listen closely. Maybe, not sure, don't know exactly. 3 layers of hedging stacked back to back for a question with exactly 1 piece of content. This could look like a complete non-answer, but it isn't, because he still tries to reference submitting a sample, the possibility that it's new evidence or old evidence retested. The content is there. It's just wrapped in 3 consecutive layers of linguistic hedging before he rushes toward a much safer direction, praising the new police leadership. By the Tel-index detection criteria, hedging isn't about using one random uncertain word. It's when hedging clusters exactly around an important question, while the answer that follows immediately after, about the new leadership, flows out smooth and decisive, with no hedging at all. That contrast between the 2 halves of the answer is exactly what confirms this is Code A6, Qualifiers and Hedging, not yet Code A1-0, reserved for complete non-answers, a code we'll see far more clearly in the 3rd round. Now let's cross-check this against the actual case file. The unknown male DNA sample was first isolated back in 2003 from a blood trace on JonBenét's underwear, which excluded the entire Ramsey family and was entered into CODIS, the federal DNA database, with no match to anyone. 5 years later, in 2008, the lab found additional touch DNA, skin cell DNA, on the waistband of her long johns, and the prosecutor at the time declared this a match solid enough to clear the whole family. Mr. Ramsey now says he isn't sure what the new evidence is, but the very old evidence his family has relied on for the past 18 years has itself been reframed at least once, from a single blood trace into a match declared with far more certainty than the underlying data actually supported. A vague statement about evidence coming from the one person who has lived with the longest, most complicated DNA history in the entire case. And before we move on, a word about the interviewer. This opening question was genuinely good, but when the answer drifted into hedging like this, the host didn't follow up, didn't ask him to clarify what kind of evidence he meant. She let that half answer slide by smoothly and moved straight to another topic.
John, I can't believe that the chiefs in the past haven't seen it as a priority, if only to become, famous in name as the chief that solved this case. It just defies logic that it's taken 3 decades for someone to come along who maybe does make this a priority and who has the chops. Do you know if they have enlisted labs like Othram? And I bring up Othram because it's famous for having solved the Idaho murders.
Yeah. No, Othram is one of the few cutting-edge labs that can do investigative genetic genealogy. IgG is the term for it. And we've been advocating that the Boulder police do that, use that technology in our case. I think if they do, we've got probably a 70–80% chance of getting an answer. It's been very successful in solving old cold cases. It's kind of the latest and greatest use of technology and DNA to solve crimes. And
I'm going to tell you something. When I saw the posting of Chief Redfern, I went deep down in the comments, and I was reading the comments. And John, I'm not going to lie, I was so disheartened to see how many people out there still believe you had something to do with it, despite the fact, and let me repeat this loud and clear, that the Boulder police and everybody else involved in investigating the murder of your daughter, they have cleared you over and over and over again. And they've gone so far as to apologize for having left you under that umbrella of suspicion for so long, to the point where Patsy died before she was cleared from that umbrella of suspicion. So for anybody watching, if you're one of the commenters, do your research before you make such painful comments about John and his family. Okay, that aside, I will say this because you brought it up when we, I think, spoke at CrimeCon, that you wish that they would ask you to re-interview. You wish that they would bring you in so that you could, once again, tell them everything that they might want to know. Is that, I know you got the meeting in January. Is that on the agenda?
The conversation moves naturally into the Othram lab and genetic genealogy technology before turning an emotional corner. The host spends a long stretch apologizing on behalf of the audience, repeating that police have cleared John Ramsey over and over again, that Patsy died before she was ever cleared of suspicion. This is one of the most sincere moments in the whole interview, but it's also the moment the host places herself squarely on his side before asking her next question about the meeting planned for January 2026. And it's inside that emotionally safe space that John Ramsey's next answer arrives.
Well, we haven't put it on the agenda yet, but we're going to ask for a meeting again in January for an update. And they've always been, at least with Chief Redfern, very cordial in honoring that request. So, they've been fairly quiet about what they're doing. I think if I read between the lines of his latest report that he issued, there's some encouraging words there. And so I'm more optimistic than I've been in a long time, certainly with new leadership. The problem with the old leadership, it was the old guard. These people that were in that police department had never investigated a murder. They decided on day one that we were guilty, literally day one. And that became the conclusion that they tried to fit the evidence to. And of course, they ran into problems because they couldn't fit the evidence.
Right. I should mention as well, just...
Stop here for the second time. He says, word for word, that the police department's old leadership never actually investigated the case, and that from day one they targeted the family. Instead, he redirects the entire focus onto the credibility and competence of an institution, exactly what the TEL index system names as attacking the investigators. The key detail confirming this is genuinely that code, rather than an ordinary complaint, is this. The accusation carries no specifics, no timeline, no concrete evidence for such a serious charge. It's entirely sweeping, which is precisely what the detection criteria ask us to check, whether the intensity of the criticism is proportionate to how serious the actual question was. Now let's cross-check this against the actual case file. In September 1998, a grand jury was convened in Boulder. Over the following 13 months, they reviewed more than 30,000 pieces of evidence and heard testimony from leading forensic experts like Barry Scheck and Henry Lee. In October 1999, they voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not on one charge, but two: child abuse resulting in death and being accessories after the fact in concealing whoever did it. Prosecutor Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictment, arguing there wasn't enough to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in court. But the grand jury's vote itself stayed sealed for 14 years, and the public didn't learn about it until 2013. 13 months, 30,000 pieces of evidence, two charges put to a vote. That is not the picture of a department that never actually investigated. What he just said isn't entirely false, but it erases the deepest, longest investigative chapter of the entire case. A chapter his own family had known the outcome of for over a decade before the public ever did. And this is also the round where the host's role shows through most clearly. Actively apologizing on behalf of the audience and repeating the exoneration story right before her question, then letting John Ramsey's evidence-free collective accusation pass without ever asking him to elaborate, is the clearest instance of emotional bias in the entire conversation.
for those who might be dabbling in the case and thinking that they know more than the average Joe, there is unknown male DNA on JonBenét's clothing, multiple different parts of her clothing, not just one piece, multiple different pieces of her clothing have the same unknown male DNA, meaning it's the same DNA from the same person. So that's a critical piece of this, of this mystery. John, have they said to you anything about what new evidence they're referring to and what new interviews they've conducted?
The interview continues, and this time the host asks the sharpest question of the entire 9.5 minutes. There's DNA from an unknown man appearing on multiple different pieces of JonBenét's clothing, all from the same single source. And does he know what the police have said about the new evidence or who they've interviewed? This is, without question, the best question of the interview. It cites the single most important DNA detail in the whole case, and clearly bundles two specific parts together. The host has obviously done her homework here. This isn't a question asked just to ask something.
No, they haven't. And of course, that's one of the questions we'll ask is, okay, what new evidence do you have? Did you test the DNA in the latest format that's necessary to do IgG, investigative genealogy? And that would be very encouraging to us if they've done that. This new technology, it's been around for 3 or 4 years, is really truly an investigative tool that allows police to investigate and look for the killer. The CODIS federal database of DNA it's been around for 30 years. It's frankly a little obsolete, in my opinion.
And stop here for the third time, the clearest instance of all. He answers, no, they haven't. Then immediately, without a second's return to the second half of the question about the new interviews, he pivots entirely to a different subject, the CODIS system being outdated. In round 1, he still tried to touch on the content before deflecting. Here, he doesn't. He doesn't attempt a single word about the new interviews and moves straight to a completely different, much easier subject. That's precisely the key distinction between Code A10, a complete non-answer, and Code A6 in round 1, where there was still some attempt at an answer, however vague. The more specific the question gets, the more completely the answer disappears from what was actually asked. That's the clearest signal across all 3 stops. And this is where the case file gets most interesting. He's betting on investigative genetic genealogy, the technology that caught the Golden State Killer, for a 70 to 80% chance of an answer. But that technology only works well with a single clean DNA profile from one person. The problem is, when the lead investigator for the district attorney's office, A. James Kohler, reviewed the original testing data, he found not just 1, but as many as 6 DNA samples from different unidentified individuals, scattered across the garrote cord and the paintbrush handle, details the 2008 exoneration letter never mentioned. Mr. Ramsey is pinning a 70 to 80% hope on precisely the kind of evidence that the internal investigative record shows to be far more complicated and mixed than the one suspect, one DNA profile picture the public has believed for nearly 20 years. As for the host, this is where the same weakness from the previous 2 rounds repeats. When John Ramsey answers only half the question before drifting into CODIS, she still doesn't circle back for the rest of it. Across all 3 stops in this video, he gets away from the hard question every single time, without ever being pressed further. It needs to be said clearly here, and only once in this entire video. All 3 moments we've just analyzed could simply reflect an unscripted, spontaneous conversation from a man who has had to retell the same pain for 29 years straight, not necessarily a sign of covering up a crime. John Ramsey was officially cleared by police through DNA back in 2008. What we've just dissected is the statement and the way it was answered, not a conclusion about who killed JonBenét. 29 years, 3 direct questions, 3 dodges, and still, not a single name has been named. Why do you think, after all this time, a concrete answer still hasn't surfaced? Leave a comment below. I read everyone. And remember, this was only 3 of the 50 signals I used to read a statement. Hit subscribe, because next time a statement doesn't add up, I'll be the first one to point out exactly where it breaks.